Lovely. So welcome to today. Today's art class is for adult beginners. It's all about soft pastels, and we're going to be drawing this chicken. So hopefully you should have received that in an email from me. And on that page, you've got a colour version and a black and white version. So this class is in two parts. The first part is doing charcoal sketch in black and white, and that's just to get familiar with the picture and to figure out how to draw it and notice the tones. And then the second part of the class is going to be done with pastels in colour. I'm going to flick my screen over now so that you'll be able to see what I'm working on my table. So I will just minimise all the people and the faces and do the thing on my iPad, which was playing up a little bit this morning. I mean, it worked, but you know when you've got to swipe a thing and the swiping thing doesn't work and it won't bring up that silly little window. So that's what's going on right now. Let me keep trying because it will come eventually. So here we go, lovely. So that's my iPad that you can see now, and I'm just going to flick it over to camera. So from here, you'll be able to see my table. And so this is this is my art diary, and this is what we're going to be working with to begin with. I'm just going to adjust my settings. Lovely. Okay, zoom in a little bit. So that's better. And then what I'm going to do is just press this down so that the focus fixes and doesn't keep changing all through the class, because that's really annoying. All right, so welcome to today. And as I said, we're going to do two parts, and this is the first part. So I have an art diary here, so it's just a little book, just a little cheapy one. You don't need anything super expensive. And it's got white pages in it, and it's really great for doing all your charcoal sketches. So that's the kind of thing that I use it for. And each class we do a little sketch and have a practice run and look at colours and so forth, and then we move on to the colour version. Oh, sorry, I've got to turn that right down. Apologies. Okay, so what you'll need is some drawing paper or a sketchbook like this one, and you'll need your notes with your black and white picture, and we're going to be looking at that. We're also going to study this one because it's got the grid marks on it. So I've popped grid marks onto the coloured version, so that's going to help us to draw the picture in proportion. So when we do the charcoal sketch, it's really just a little practice run. It's just a rehearsal basically, and a nice way to kind of become familiar with the tones in the picture. So by tone, I mean your lights and your darks that are in the picture, and that will become relevant to the colours that we choose afterwards. So if you keep your little notes next to you, what I'm going to do is I just roughly draw up a space on my page that's around about the same dimensions as the picture that we're doing today. So we're working in a landscape format, which means it's wider across the top and bottom and narrower on the sides. If you're a precise person and you want to measure it exactly, then go ahead and do that. I like to kind of stay a little bit loose at this point, just so that we can get into art mode and relax into it a little bit and not get too caught up in being precise. So what I've done here is draw in my landscape page, basically. That's about the same proportions as my picture. And then I'm going to draw the little grid on there. So you can see on the coloured picture that I've popped a grid on there. So what I mean by grid is lines that break up all the sections. So we've got a halfway line across and a halfway line down. And then I've broken those halves into halves again. So we've got 16 squares basically on the picture. Now, there are lots of different ways of drawing things and measuring and all that kind of stuff. But I find this way is actually probably the easiest for me anyway. And if I break this picture down into segments, then I find it really easy to just draw all the shapes that I see, and then we can work on the tones and the shading and so forth. So as I said, this is very rough and it's a bit loose, and I like to start off that way just to get into the mood. When you're holding your bit of charcoal, this is a very skinny little stick of charcoal. You can get charcoal pencils, so you might have a pencil, or you can get all different sizes of charcoal sticks. It's a big fat chunky one, and then there's some thinner ones. And so I use a combination of both. To draw this up at first though, I'm going to use a thin, longer piece, and then when we do some shading I'll use a short fat one. So when you're holding the bit of charcoal, if you just hold it loose on the end like that, don't try to hold it like a pencil. If you're holding it, I'm left-handed by the way, so if it looks a bit weird, that's why. If you are holding a pencil or whatever like this, then you are being very precise because you don't have a lot of movement in your hand, and you have to be, you know, very precise with your lines. Whereas if you hold it at the end and have it a little bit loose, you've got a lot more freedom of movement. And I find that's actually a little bit more relaxing, and I can do gentle, soft marks without having to get too uptight about it. So just try to keep your hand loose, hold the end of your stick or your pencil, whatever you've got, and we'll start drawing in the shapes. So I've just done a little bit here. So what I've done is I've looked at this top quadrant, or 16th, I'll call it segment, this top left segment, and I'm looking at the outline of the thing around the head of the chook rooster, this red thing, crest, no, whatever it's called. Anyway, I'm looking at the shape of that, and I've drawn in what I think that looks like. So that's my line in that little section there. I'm only looking in that section, okay? Once you've done that bit, then kind of change your focus to this section. So this is the next one down. We're working down in rows. And so I can see that that little red edge comes across on the top right-hand corner of this little segment. So that's how I can draw in that shape, just to the line. And then you can see that the feathers, or the back of the head of the chicken, that line comes down like this, or probably more like that. So that's that section done. Okay, so we've done this block and this block. Then we're going to move down into this one on the left. So there's a third one down on the left-hand row. Continue that line down through there. So you can see that it just cuts off on this little corner here. So if I continue my line down through there, that's all I need to put in that on that bit. The rest is feathers and things, and we'll pop them in afterwards. All we're looking at the moment is the outline of the shape. Down inside this bottom left-hand corner, we don't have anything in there much to worry about, so we'll leave that section undone. Now let's pop up back to the top again and look at the second row across and this top segment. So all I can see in here are a couple of little dips like that, and there's another tiny one there, and that's the top of the crest that's sitting there. So we just need to put those little lines in. And sometimes if you can't see the shape of the thing that you're drawing, have a look at the background instead. So I'll use this top left example. If I was having trouble drawing that shape there, then you can kind of reverse your brain and look at the shape of the background. That's called the negative space. So the negative space around the object is the background, and I can actually look at that shape instead of the shape of this. Can you see what I'm talking about? So there's kind of two shapes in there. So you can kind of reverse your brain a little bit and look at the outside rather than the inside if you're trying to draw a shape or something. So sometimes that helps. Okay, hope I didn't confuse you then. So down into we're back into this little section here, and I can see there's some white lines that sort of come up through here, and they're just the feathers. So I can do a soft little outline like that, and then come down into this next segment and continue that line across through there. So see how we're drawing each part as we go down. Now down in this bit here, I can see that there's white feathers and then there's red skin. So there's no hard, fast lines between the skin and the feathers. So I'm just going to do a soft sort of mark like this. So don't do anything too defined. Just keep it kind of soft because they sort of merge into each other, don't they? So you've got to kind of, the white feathers and the red skin that sort of blend together. I'm just looking inside this little segment. This one's got a lot of detail because we have an eye as well as the feathers. And there's this little white tuft of feathers just there too. So if we just roughly or lightly draw in the shape of that, so that sits about there inside this square or segment. And then we've got this eye. Eyes are sometimes a bit scary, but if we break it down into pieces, it should be reasonably easy to do. So what I'm looking at with the eye is where does it sit within this little grid section, within this segment. So it kind of sits right over on the right-hand side, so it nearly touches this line. So I can draw a little mark there. And then it comes up and it's got a sort of an angle up to about there. And if I look at the width of the eye, I can see that it's about 1/3 of the way across inside this segment. So if I mark out my thirds in here, I can think, okay, so it comes, the edge of it comes to about there. So you can actually pop dots in different spots and then kind of join the dots to create your shapes. So that's my eye. So just looking at how far it is from the line, how far down it is inside that segment. And I reckon the top of the eye sits at about the halfway mark in that little section. And then the edge of it sits at about 1/3 across. So when you measure things like that and put them in where you see them, it makes it a whole lot easier. So that's the little eye. And the eye is important because it's the first thing that you'll look at when you see the painting or the picture, because it's going to have a little shine and glow on it. So if you want to pop the pupil in there and then just shade the rest of it sort of softly so that it doesn't get too dark, and darken off that pupil a little bit. The best part about doing the eye is when you get the shine in. So I like to put the shine in at the end because that's when you get the joy. That's when you go, wow, looks amazing. It's got a little tear duct too. Can you see that just there? And it kind of, that just goes over into the other segment on the right, tiny little bit over. So that's the eye, and we don't have to get it perfect right now. There's a line around the eye too, so you can pop that in as well. And again, just measure that with your eye and see where it kind of comes to. Okay, so when you break this down into pieces, it makes it a whole lot easier. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, and you just put all the pieces in as you go around. So let's move down into the next section, which is below this one. And I can see there's a sort of a line down there and then comes down. So that's the red area that we've just drawn the outline for. Okay, so it's got a little wiggle on the left side there, comes down and then off into the bottom segment. If you wanted to draw in this section as well, so we've got a little wiggly line through there as well. And then we've also got this rounded edge here that comes from the bottom red section under the beak. So that kind of rounds around in the corner here. This bit, I've gone too high. This is my kneadable eraser. So it used to be nice and clean, but it's not anymore. But they're wonderful for getting charcoal off and pastel. So always have one of those handy if you make a mistake and you need to take something off. Okay, so as I said, that was a little bit high and it crosses over about halfway. So that means I've made this one too far over. So see how by doing that, you kind of measure that. Just make your measurements across the little grid section and you can kind of put things all where they need to sit. It's a really, really great way to draw. And then we've got the bottom of that little white tuft as well. So the little feathers that just sit beyond the eye there, but the bottom of that comes off into this grid section too. Okay, so now we're going to continue down into the second or the bottom section and follow that line down through there. So I can see it comes on a slight angle and then it gets nearly to the bottom and it comes around like a little earlobe sort of shape, isn't it? Cool. And then come back over to the right side and we'll get that piece that's coming from under the beak. I need to find out what these things are actually called and make a nice round line like that. So can you see already how just by doing all these little pieces bit by bit, we're starting to create something that looks like a thing already. So that's kind of fun. All right, so we'll move over now into the next row and we'll start at the top again. And again, we've got little V shapes actually up the top here. So there's 3 V's basically. When I can break things down into shapes that I understand, like V's and hearts and triangles and stuff, it just makes it a whole lot easier to interpret, I guess. So I've got 3 V's there. That one should come down a bit lower. And that's all that's pretty much in that bit, except for a couple of loose little feathers that pop up through there. And then we come down into the second one. So it comes down with some little feathers there. In front of the eye, can you see it's almost like a Y shape? So it kind of comes, it's not a hard line, it's sort of a soft line. It comes down through there. It's a little bit of a Y or a V shape just in there. That's going to give us some tone. So just pop a bit of charcoal in that shape and you could smudge it off with your fingers a little bit if you want it to be softer. Just for the shadow. And over on the other side, so we've got a little dark section here. So that's a line that comes up here and it's on top of the beak. It comes into all those little bits of feathers there. So now I've done that, I realise this one's too big, so I'll move that over. Okay, so that's a little crease there. And then when we come down into the next section, we've got this wiggly line of the red skin that's above the beak. So draw that line, oops, wrong angle. So I'm going to draw the line down and across. It's a funny little shape. And then bring it around and down. It's a bit like a folding fabric really, isn't it? So I've got this funny little wiggly S bend in there. And just let me have a look at that again. I'm going to see if I get the shape right. A little like an S, and then it's got sort of wrinkles. So we need to draw a shape like that in that section. Something like that. So it's like the edge of fabric and it has this beautiful little fold in it. And so we'll be able to achieve the look of that with our different tones. Lovely, lovely. So that's an interesting little segment, isn't it? Because it's got all of these funny little wiggly shapes in there. Cool. Now in the bottom one, we've got to come down in an arc. So that sort of tapers off, that S shape tapers off towards the bottom. And then there's a slight shadow on the left side of this line here. So hopefully this is all starting to come together for you. Let me know if I'm going too fast and you want me to slow down. Okay. So we've got that funny little S and just follow the outline of it. So look at the hard, darker lines and follow those, draw those in. Don't worry about all the shadows and things just yet. We'll sort that later. We just want to get the outlines in so we know where to colour in basically. Okay, so now we're going to move back up into the top of the right side. So this is the last row or column, and I'm going to trace or draw the shape of the cone or that red piece down through there. So again, it's gone too far over. Draw it down through there. So I can see in my section here, I've just got a tiny little bit of red in that left corner, and the rest of it is blank or empty in this top right segment. And then we're going to just draw a line down through there. You can see it's all kind of wiggly, isn't it? It's not a smooth, hard line. It's sort of got lots of wiggles and bumps and things in it. And that's all we need to pop into this segment here. There's a little bit of shadow there if you want to pop that in. It goes up through there. Cool. And then as we come down into this next bit, and sometimes if you're feeling like, oh, this is all too much, I can't look at it, just cover up all the parts except the bit that you're doing. Sometimes I find that really a lot easier. So for instance, I could slide this under here and just leave that section showing, because that's all I'm drawing right now is that bit. I'm not looking at anything else. And so when you do that, it gives you a lot more clarity, and you can actually just focus on the pieces. And when you do that, it all comes together in the end. So we've got the lovely little end of the beak, and there's two pieces to that beak. We've got the top beak and then the bottom beak. So the top section sits over bottom one and curls up off the edge of the side, the grid bit, and then we've got the bottom of the beak there. Okay, and then that goes away into, oh, I forgot that bit before, into that segment. Oops. And then we've got a tiny little bit of red in that corner there, and then we've got a little bit more red just in the bottom segment, and then it kind of folds back in and tapers away. And basically then that's the outline of our chook or rooster. So as I said, if you get confused looking at something and it's all too much, just cover up the segments and draw what you see in each piece, and it'll make it a lot easier. Much, much easier. All right. So now we've got that all done, and then just make sure you check everything. So make sure that you've got your lines, you know, sitting in where they need to be in relation to your grid mark. That's why we do the grid, so that we can kind of make sure everything is in the right spot in each part, each section. Just checking all that stuff, checking my edges, making sure that they're all, you know, too far, not too far in or too far out, and looking at where all the lines go. Once you've got that sorted out and you're fairly confident that everything's where it needs to be, then you can just lightly rub out some of your grid marks, because when you start to blend and merge and colour, it can get a little bit distracting. So I'm going to rub them out, and we're not going to worry about filling the background in today. I know some of you have a light coloured paper, so we'll see how we go on that. Because darker paper would be good for this because it's a light subject. So I've rubbed out most of my grid lines, and just with the kneadable eraser. Now we're going to, just for a short while, we're going to look at the tones in here. So to look at those, we need to study the black and white picture. So if we have a look at that, I'll tuck it under here, then this is a really good way to just have a look and see where it's darkest and where it's lightest, and you know where to put your different tones. So tones are your lights and your darks and your mids. For this, I'm going to grab a short fat piece of charcoal. So that was the skinny one I was using before. So now I'm going to pick this one up. The reason I like this size for shading is that I can lie it down on the paper like this, and I can just push it around. So what I want to do is see where it's really dark and just push this in the dark sections. And because it's a short piece, I can kind of smudge it a little bit and just let it kind of sit on the paper and fill up a small space in a short time. And then if I need to tip it up for a harder line or a smaller mark, I can do that too. So let's just block in, what we call block in, the dark areas in here that you can see. And you'll find them by looking at your black and white version. So I can see on the left-hand side of the red section, it's much darker, isn't it? Where the little feathers all start to come out, it's quite dark and there's shadow under there. So even though they're white feathers, it's kind of a light grey colour. So if you darken off around that, and I am using the end of my charcoal stick, but I've got a kind of a loose end on it, and so what I'm doing is I've got it flat on the paper, and then to get a wide loose mark, I'm just tilting it up a little bit so that I get this lovely wide line like that. If I wanted a sharp edge, I could tip it all the way up and use the very tip of it or the edge of it to get a hard, sharp mark. And then if you want a wide, soft mark, you can actually put the whole thing down on the paper and wipe it over and get a nice, wide, gentle mark like that. But at the moment, we're just going to focus on the dark areas. So the dark areas are in all the creases. That's where the shadows are. So putting them around into all the dark parts. And then we'll put a mid-tone down. So the mid will be a lighter grey colour. So under the beak, it's quite black, isn't it, under there? And on the beak itself, on the bottom side, it's darker because there's shadow. And where else is it dark? So on the top of the beak, between that and the red section, there's some shadow and it's dark in there. There's a lot of dark around the eyes. So around the inside of the eye, it's got a dark line. And of course, we've got the dark pupil. And there's a few little dark creases in there as well. So look at all the little creases in the skin. Don't stress if you not getting it precise. We don't need to get too precise. As long as you're just noticing the lights and the darks. That's what's important. So this section of the class is just to get us relaxed, just to get us into art mode and study the picture and become familiar with it. Okay, so I think I've got all the dark bits in now. So that's kind of all the shadow areas where it's blackest. And now we can just start to sweep the charcoal around and get that lovely mid-tone going on. So the crest, or the red areas on the chicken or the rooster, are the darkest areas, aren't they? Other than the really dark shadow parts, but that's actually the dark grey is where all the red parts are. So if we just run the charcoal around and fill in all the red sections with this dark grey kind of tone. So that means just pressing not too hard with your charcoal, just fairly lightly, but rubbing it around so you get nice coverage. Leave some spaces over here for your white feathers, and I'll show you a trick in a second with the eraser to get some white back in there. And then I'm just going to run my charcoal around again in the red area. So that's around the eye and around here under the cheek. And as you do that, it'll sort of start to get some texture and form because we've got all that lovely dark in where the shadows are. And now we've got our mid-tone where we've got the mid-colour. And we'll leave the white feathers white, which is going to be a bit tricky actually because we've got to put a little bit of grey in there to get some tone going on. but I'll show you how to do that. That's why erasers are wonderful. Helps us get the lights back in. Okay, so most of that red area now I've made kind of a grey colour. And then if you wanted to, you could pop your fingers into there and just kind of push all of that in, so you'll get dirty fingers, and that's okay. So you can kind of smooth it off a little bit if you want to. I like doing that because it kind of, then it blends a little bit and you end up with all this lovely contour feeling. So the harder you press, the sort of softer it'll go. If you've got willow charcoal, which is very soft, it'll just smudge everything and make it really light. If you just go over it lightly and don't press too hard, because you don't want to lose all that work you just did. I can hear someone going, oh, I just pressed too hard. Okay. And then just run your eye around it again, and maybe you need to darken up somewhere around the eye, for instance, or around the beak if you know it's kind of got lost and soft and smudged in a bit too much. Then maybe you might want to darken up a few of those lines so you can define them again. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm just marking in a few of the lines where I can see they need to be, you know, redefined, because it's all kind of gotten a little bit too grey. And that's what's so lovely about charcoal. You can just kind of keep coming back with it. All right. So where we've got some feathers, what I'm going to do is just show you how to do some little feathery marks. And this will also work with the pastels later on. So I've got my piece of charcoal on the table, or the paper flat like that. And so to get those lovely, see those feathery marks that are just coming down out of the neck there, if you pull your short bit of charcoal across like this, so don't use the tip of it. If you use the tip, well, you can do that, but it's not going to cover as much area. And this way, by pulling the whole piece on its side down through there, it kind of makes a softer mark, but it's also a little feathery looking. So you can actually pull that in the direction of those feathers. You can see how that starts to give you some texture, and it starts to look like actual feathers because we're pulling it in the direction. And just noticing on the picture, you know, how those feathers fall and which way they go. So they kind of all sprout out from the head a little bit, don't they? And then they come down around the back of the neck there. So what you need to do is figure out which direction things are moving in, and then pull the charcoal or pastel, whatever you're using, in that direction so that it picks up the texture and the body of the thing that you're doing. So try not to fill up the whole thing with charcoal, because otherwise you'll end up with a grey chicken, not a white one. If you do fill it all up, then this cool thing you can do, so I'll show you up in this section here, because I've filled up all this area with charcoal, but I still want to get some of the white feathers poking up through that area. And so what you can do with your kneadable eraser is you can knead it and get a really nice sharp knife edge kind of shape like this, and you can draw with that. You can actually do this kind of thing, and what it does is it takes the charcoal off and puts the white back in, or just shows the white of the paper. So why they call it kneadable is you've got to keep kneading it or pushing it around, because each time you do that you get charcoal on the eraser and it gets dirty. So you've got to keep reshaping it to find a clean edge to remove more. If you keep using the same piece, you'll just put more back down. So you've got to keep finding a clean edge. But it's a wonderful way to get your whites back in with charcoal, because sometimes we put too much down and then you can't get it off. Unless you've got a white charcoal pencil, of course, because they're awesome as well. They're wonderful for getting your light in. But this is great. I love doing this. It's heaps of fun because you can just take it out And if you need to put any charcoal back in or you take too much off, then you can. So it's quite, you know, pliable, and you can really have a lot of fun with it. So for instance, this little tuft of feathers on the beside the eye, you know, that little white tuft of feathers, I kind of put too much charcoal down and it all smudged and I lost that. So now I can use my eraser and take some of that out to get the white back in. Even around the edges of the feathers here around the neck area, you can do the same thing. Little short marks or little short movements to get those short little hairs coming through there. And see on the cheek of the bird, you've got these little short whiskers. So we can do the same thing there with the eraser and just draw those back in. Kind of fun. When we do it with pastels, we'll use white pastels, so we'll actually draw them in with pastels. But this is kind of reversing everything with the charcoal on the white paper. And then if it's not working out, you can just put more charcoal on and smudge it back in again. So it's really, really great. Lots of fun. And I can whiten up my beak, so I can lighten that off again if I put too much down. Put a few little hairs in here. So you can actually have a lot of fun with charcoal. It's a lovely medium to play with. And this is a nice little exercise just to warm us up and get us ready for the next bit. The next thing I want to pop in just before we finish with this part is the white, the shine in the eye. So that's always the highlight, I reckon. So I can pop this in here. I have to have a couple of dabs at it to get the white glow going on in there. I think I've taken too much out. But that's okay, because you can come back with your bit of charcoal and just draw around it and keep the little white shine there. Because nothing brings an eye to life like a little shine. There we go. So we're going to finish up with this part in a moment, because I do want to move on to the coloured part of the class, because that's the most funnest. And yeah, in a hope of getting it finished today, that would be good, wouldn't it? Then it would be good to get onto that pretty soon. So I hope that section was informative and helpful and kind of got you in the mood, and you know, a nice little way to rehearse the drawing and figure out what it's going to look like and how it's going to fit and how to draw him. Cool. So we'll do that next. So we'll set up for the colour version. As I mentioned before, if you've got a dark piece of paper, that's going to be really handy, because this is a light coloured picture. So when you put something light like this onto a dark background, it just makes it pop. It really does look lovely, especially in pastels, because your pastels are so vibrant and bright and beautiful. So what I've chosen for today is a black piece of paper, because I love working on black. I know one or two of you may not have dark or black paper and you've only got white. So we'll just have to make that work and it will be okay. The other option, of course, is that you could fill in the background of your picture if you wanted to make it dark. So with pastels, you can do that. You can just, you know, colour the whole thing in if you want to. But for the class and for the purpose of the class, we won't today, because I just want to get on to this guy and make sure that we get him finished, because I think he's going to be rather beautiful when he's done. Okay, so let's get started. So we'll pop away this for a minute. Actually, I'll pop it just here, because what I want to talk about first up is the selection of colours that we're going to use. So when I'm choosing colours to do my painting in, I usually just grab the picture and I hover it over my selection of pastels, and I just, you know, try and find things that match. So I've done that already. So if you want to choose your colours while I talk about them, then we'll do that. You might be organised already and have some stuff already chosen. All right, so and I'll put some here. So what I've got is this is my blue violet, which is my dark. It's a beautiful dark, and that's going to be so nice in the shadows. The blue violet is always lovely for shadows because it's got a lovely violet base, and it's really, really lovely. So we'll be putting that down first in the dark sections, a little bit like we did with the dark charcoal, and then we'll go over those areas and build them up in layers. So blue violet is my dark one. The next darkest, I guess, is the red. So I've got this lovely red pastel here. So we need a red one for all the bits of red skin and things. And red is often a tricky colour to get because, I don't know, I just have trouble finding reds. They're either too dark or too dull or too yellow or too something. But whatever you have will be fine, so don't stress too much. I've picked up this terracotta orangey sort of colour because of the eye, so I want to pop that into the eye. I'll probably use some of it in the feathers as well and in the beak, because the beak has kind of an orangey yellow tinge. So I've got that one there. I have yellow, so I grabbed a bit of yellow. Some yellows are horrible. This one's not very nice. It's a bit hard. Ugh, I might have to get another yellow. Don't like that one at all. Something like that would be good for the beak. So I'll find another one of those. And then I've got a few like beigey sort of earthy colours. They're umber colours. So this is like a terracotta almost colour. And I can kind of see some of that in the feathers as well. So even though this is a white bird, it's actually got a lot of orange and yellow and ochre-y kind of colours in it. I've also got this colour, which is like a sandstone colour. So they're very similar, but I wanted those because I want to build up the tone or the depth. I think that's a similar colour. And the other one that's really great is Australian grey, and I'm not sure, but I think that might be a piece of it. So Australian grey is an Art Spectrum colour, and it's not white, but it's got this lovely creamy grey sort of tinge to it. And I really like using that before I put white down, because white's always the last final, colour that adds all the highlights. A bit like we did on the charcoal version. We waited until the end and just put some whites back in, and that's when you really get those little highlights. So this is a nice option for not quite white, and I love using it. So Australian grey, I've got about, I don't know how many of those, but I can never find them if they don't have their name on. So this is one with part of the name on, so that's how I know what that one's called. And it is, yeah, it's the same, I think. Yep, cool. So that's that one. And then I've got white. So white we'll put on at the end onto the little eye to give it some shine, and maybe a few of the feathers and bits and pieces just to add some highlights. So they're my colours. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 colours, which is quite a big palette really. And if you feel like you want to add more colours, or you might want to put some blue or something in there as you go, then feel free to do that. Don't be afraid to pick up other colours and add them in. Now I've said blue, I feel like I want to put blue now. Oh dear. Could work actually. Even some purple would be nice, just to get in under those feathers to get some of the texture and shadow in there. Cool. All right, I'm just going to go find another yellow, and then we'll talk about paper. So different pastels will feel different, and sometimes it depends on the pigment, which is the colour, or the brand. So this, for example, this is a Schminky yellow, and it's really creamy. So that's much nicer than that other one I had, which was really hard and horrible. So you'll find, yeah, they all feel a little bit different. Some are harder. If they're harder, then they're really good for doing more drawing kind of work. If they're soft, they're lovely for blending. They'll also fill the paper up a lot faster if they're soft. So I like to have a nice range of hard and soft. But I do like Art Spectrum brand because they're kind of in between, and they just work for me. Plus I can get them easily at work, so I don't have to order them or anything. So that is my favourite brand. So now we've got some colours sorted out. The next thing you need to do is look at your paper. So this is I have a sheet of black paper here. Just leave those colours there in case you're still doing that. So this is colour fixed paper. It feels like sandpaper. It's really quite gritty, and it's also an Art Spectrum brand. I like Art Spectrum because they're Australian made, so that's a cool thing too. And it's got some nice texture, so you can actually get quite a lot of pastel onto this type of paper, and it comes in all different colours. So you can get it in beiges and pinks and purples and black and blue and green and all kinds. So it's lovely, and it's really nice to work on coloured paper. And the advantage of that is that you can actually not colour the background in sometimes, like today, for instance, or you can fill the whole thing up. So just depending on how you feel and what you want to do is, it gives you, it's got nice options, and other times you can let some of the paper colour show through in your art. So it becomes quite important when you're choosing what colour to paint on. I'm now taping my paper down onto my little drawing board. So this is just a bit of, I don't know what it is, board. Well loved and used. And the reason I like to tape it onto a board is so that it sits still and I don't have to hold it down all the time. If you're on an easel or you're upright, you might want to tape it all the way around, just so that it stays where it is and doesn't fall down. If you do put tape all the way around it, make sure that you either stick the tape to a cloth or something first before you put it onto the paper, because if it's on there for a while, it can tear when you take it off. So just be a little bit careful with that, especially if you leave it on for too long. So yeah, just be very careful. And when you do pull it off, if you've got it all the way down the sides, pull it away from the painting, so outwards rather than in, because sometimes it'll come in and it'll actually tear what you've painted. And it's happened to me before, and it's very disappointing because you can't fix it, unfortunately. So just be really careful with your tape that it's not too sticky. But if you're flat like this on a table, then just on the corners it's fine, because we just want to keep it there for a little while and then we'll take it off later. So that's that bit. Now I'm going to pop my drawing away. Put him over there. I've got my little palette of colours, and I like to keep these in a separate box to everything else. That way I know what I've been using. And if you don't get it finished and you come back tomorrow to finish it off, if you've got all your colours in one spot like this, then you don't have to go, oh, which red did I use, or which yellow, or whatever. So it just makes life easier for yourself. So I like to keep that in a separate box, and I do that for every painting until I'm finished with it, because it just means that I don't have to figure out what colours I used. I have my reference photo next to me, so that's the one on the notes here, and it has the grid, which is what we're going to use again to draw this up. I've also got it on an iPad on my desk, so I can look at both versions. If it's on a screen or an iPad, it's really cool because you can zoom in and see the detail, and that's really handy. You also get much better colour on the screen, whereas a printout's usually a little bit dull. But it's handy to have this nearby. So have your reference photo close by and your paper all set up, ready to go, your palette next to you. The other thing I've got is an old towel lying on the table. So when I'm doing pastels on a flat surface like this, the dust of the pastels just kind of gathers on the page sometimes, and it's hard to kind of get rid of it. So I like to tip it off, basically. So try really hard not to blow it, because the first instinct is you want to blow it off the paper, but don't do that, because it'll end up all over you and your house and your furniture and everything else. So the best thing to do is just pick up your board like this and tip it off, bang, bang, tip, tip, onto the little towel or something that's next to you, and then you can shake it off outside later. So that's a good option. So what we're going to do first up is rule up our grid mark. So these pages are 23 by 20, by 30. So I've got to find the halfway and then the quarter way and put my grid on like I've got on this picture. So if you're working on a light coloured paper, then a charcoal will be fine. You can use charcoal with pastel, no problem at all. Don't use a graphite or a lead pencil because they show through. So if you put a lead pencil drawing down, it's really hard to cover it with pastel. It'll often kind of shine through and look really strange. So if you have graphite and lead pencils, hide them from yourself. Don't let them out. Not while you're using pastels anyway. And if you're on dark paper like I am, then you might want to use a pastel pencil or a white charcoal pencil, just so you can see the lines. So what I'm going to do is very lightly just do it very lightly, draw this grid on, because if you're on paper that you want to take it off later, so you want to remove all the lines later and let the paper just be the colour, then you want to just press lightly because the pastel sticks really well to this paper. It's really gritty and it hangs on nice and tight, and it's hard to get off if you press really hard. So just press lightly so you can get it off afterwards. So I'm just finding my halfway mark. So my halfway across is 15 and then it's 22 and a half or 7.5 to find my quarter lines. And then I'm going to rule up these grid marks lightly, because I don't want them to mark my paper. But it's still got to be bright enough for me to see. And then halfway on the other side, so half of 23 is 11.5. Half of that is 5 3/4. So if your paper's a different size, you might need to have different measurements. I only know this off by heart because I do it all the time. Again, just ruling those lines on. And once you've got your grid mark on there, then you can start to draw in the outline again, just like we did before. And so, because we've already done this once, it's going to be, should be a little bit easier this time around because we've done it once already. And as I said before, if you get confused looking at the whole thing, just cover up, the other sections and look at each section piece by piece and draw that in. So that's what we'll do. We'll start at the top left corner again and just gently draw in the outlines that we want. And then continue down. Oops, too far over. See, so by pressing lightly with your pencil, you can actually get that off pretty easily, because I want my black background to be really nice and black at the end so that my white chicken stands out. And as I said, if you're on light paper, we can still do that. Okay, so down through there, and then so we'll just draw in each part. Remember, the top segments have these little V's in them where the crest is, and it's once you've done it a couple of times, you think it comes easier, doesn't it? Practice is everything. And then when you put the eye in, remembering how close it sits to the grid line, how far down inside that segment it is. And the top of the eye is about halfway up on that section. The bottom should be a bit lower. And then we've got a little tuft of white feathers on the side there. So just lightly marking where that is. And we've got the edge of the feathers where the feathers and the skin meet. So that's just a kind of a loose line. I've never painted this before, so we're all in this together today. In fact, pretty much everything that we do in class is brand new to me as well. So each week I just kind of think, what will I paint this week? What will we do? And I have a lot of images to choose from. And so normally I just scroll through those and see what inspires me most and decide that that's what we're going to do. And it's also based on, you know, trying to keep the subjects varied each week. So what did we do last week? Flowers, that's right. And the week before was lemons. So I'm kind of, you know, trying to mix it up and have birds and animals and flowers and fruit and different things to keep it interesting. So I don't know what we're doing next week. I usually don't know until a couple of days before, which is terrible on my behalf as far as management and organisation goes. But I rely on intuition a lot. You kind of just run with whatever's, you know, whatever's happening at the time. So just up into this next quarter, drawing in the crown there. It's like a crown, isn't it? And just draw lightly. You don't have to draw hard marks because we're actually going to, you'll probably lose a lot of your outlines and things as we go because we'll be putting the pastel on and it's quite chunky and smudgy. So you'll end up covering up a lot of this with pastel. And so another tip, which we should do before we get much further, and I'll do that in a sec, is to make sure that you can see where your grid lines were if you happen to lose them. So for instance, I can get a dark pencil, or if you've got tape all around your page, you just do this on the tape and just mark in where each little line is, so that if later on we cover it all up and you're thinking, oh no, where does that eye go again? Where's my grid line? Because you might have filled it all in. And so if you've got your marks on the outside here, you can, you know, kind of get your ruler and work out, okay, so that's halfway, so the eye must be there-ish. So it'll help you find things later on if we lose all the marks. Okay, I'm going to keep doing this. So as I said, we don't want to do, you know, a whole lot of detail, but we do need to get some of the significant marks in so that we can put the right tones and colours down where we need to put them. There we go. And across through there. So that's probably enough information to get started with. As long as we've got the main lines and marks in, then I think we'll be okay and kind of figure out the rest as we go. Cool. And because I've only done a very light mark now, I can get those off quite happily without staining my paper. So if you want to just test that before we go much further, you can do that. And if you've got your little grid marks around the edge, then that should be okay. So I will take them out in the background area where I want to leave it black or unpainted. And as I said before, if you've got a light paper and you decide later on that you want to darken it, you can always just fill it in with pastel and do it that way. So you can fill the whole background in. All right, so we'll start off with blocking in just a bit of the dark areas like we did with the charcoal and noticing where the shadows are. And then we'll sort of smush a bit of colour around. We are going to have a 10-minute break shortly, and that'll just be to grab a cuppa and have a refresh, drink of water and a bit of a rest and a stretch, and then we'll come back and carry on. So let's just pick up our, let's pop some red in first. So if you pick up your red pastel that you've chosen for today, and what we're going to do is just very gently wipe it around where all the red section is. Okay, so we're not going to get into the detail too much. It's literally just putting it on its side like this. And if your pastels are harder, you might want to press a little bit firmer to get the colour to stick to your paper. But I just want to get some red down on here, because what we'll do is once we've got it down, then we can push it in gently with our fingers and kind of get into the blending mood. This is a lovely bright red. It's so yummy on the black, isn't it? It's really nice. Okay, and then there's red in the face. So if you fill in the crest up the top and just do it lightly. We don't want to put too much pastel down. So that the trick is to just layer this very, very gently. So we don't want to fill the tooth of the paper up too much, because if you do that, you won't be able to get any more on. So the trick is to just layer it on slowly and lightly. And all we really need to do at this point is to get enough pastel on the paper so that we can start to blend it all in once we get a little bit of dark in here as well. So I'm putting red down first, because if I put the dark in first, it wouldn't be easy to see on the black paper. So we'll do this bit first, and then we can put some shadows in. So that's pretty much all the red bits. What I want to do is just highlight this little S-bend thingy so that I don't lose where that belongs in there. And I'm just making that a bit redder so I can find it again. So if you have parts that you'd like to be able to find again, then do that. For instance, the edge of this bit here is brighter. So now we're starting to look at the tones and the different shades. So where you see a lighter kind of red, I want you to press a little bit firmer and get more red down on the paper like that. So can you see how I've kind of highlighted the lighter red sections? And so that's this section here that's kind of sticking out. So that's coming forward. So what we want to do is brighten that up a little bit so we can put some shadow in around it to create that feeling of texture and form. And same here. So this edge here is lighter than in there behind it, isn't it? So if I press a little bit harder and get a bit more red to stick to that bit there, then that's going to help me create that form again. And same over here on the little S-bend. I'm going to call it an S-bend. I don't know what else to call it. And so that bit there, it's got a little flip, little skirt kind of thing. And so that comes around too, and it's brighter there. It's also a bit brighter there. So just check your picture and notice where it's reddest, or lightest, I should say, where it's lightest. You can see up the top of the crest here, there's like a bump in it, and the top of the bump is a bit lighter. So that's telling us there's form in there as well. And it's kind of catching the light. Cool. And then just here around the eye is also a little bit brighter there. So by doing that, you keep training yourself to see the tones in colour. So we saw tones in charcoal before, in the black and the white and the mids, so all the greys. And now we've got to kind of convert that into colour. And so it's a bit of a brain twister sometimes to say, oh, what's red? Is it light, dark, or mid, or what? Well, it'll depend on what you're painting. So in this instance, it's actually one of the darker tones. If you look at your black and white picture, you can see all the red bits are darker. So it's a darker or mid-tone compared to what else we're going to be using, which will all be light tones for the feathers. So in the scheme of this, the red is a dark mid. Okay, so if you've highlighted some of those red sections like I've done, and just keep it loose though, just, you know, you don't want to get too precise. Don't worry about getting it exactly right and getting all the lines and being really frustrated, because I know it's easy to get very frustrated with pastels because they're so loose and so kind of chunky and messy, and it's really difficult to get fine lines. But you know, different courses and horses and stuff, and some people love them, some people hate them. I like them because they're so flexible, and I think it suits my personality to have something that I can kind of, I don't know, be a bit loose with, because I'm not very precise. It's not my kind of thing. All right, so now we've done that, let's pick up the blue violet. So that's the darkest one. And if you don't have blue violet, then a black or a really dark blue or a really dark purple will be perfect for this. So anything with a bit of a blue or purple tinge is nice, and preferably as dark as you can get it. So blue violet's my favourite. I love it to bits and can't live without it. But what I want to do now is, and because it's a very strong colour or pigment, I'm just going to gently touch it where I can see shadow. So much like we did before with charcoal. And if you want to look at your black and white version of the picture, you'll probably find it a lot easier. So just find all the dark bits, all the blackest bits, and put some of your red violet there. Okay, and don't put too much down because it is such a strong, rich colour. That's if you have red violet. Otherwise, use whatever you've got. But just go lightly, because what we want to do is just create some shadow and some texture where you see dark or darkest. So for instance, in the eye there, we'll do the eye afterwards, but there's a bit of dark around the eye. And the other thing we need to think about is which direction is the light coming from. So let's see if we can figure that out. There's no real strong light in this particular picture, so there's not anything that's really, you know, glowing. So I would say, based on where the reflection in the eye is and where the shadows are falling, that the light would be coming from above. So maybe it's just like a cloudy, overcast sort of day, and there's no really bright light anywhere. But there's still got to be direction of light somehow, somewhere. So let's say it's coming from above, which means that all the shadow areas will be under something. So if something's on top of something else, it's going to be casting a shadow. For instance, if you look under the beak, so the skin or the red area under the beak is darker in here because the beak will be casting a shadow onto that section. And so looking at where all the shadows are is going to help us create the form and the body of this thing. So for instance, there's that little ridge across the top of the crown there, and it's got just a slight ridge, isn't it? It's nothing terribly big, but you can see there's a bit of shadow and a bit of light up here. So there's shadow on the right, and then the light section is where we put the harder red, and that's catching the light slightly. So it's not super bright. If you wanted to emphasize that and, you know, make it more dramatic, then you definitely could do that. You've just got to decide which bits you want to emphasize and how bright you want the light to be. So I'm really loving what the red looks like. It's very cool. So I'm just running my eyes around here and checking for light. While I'm here, I'm going to put a bit of this blue violet just into the beginnings of the feathers around the neck area. If you have a look at the feathers there, you can see that there's quite a lot of dark or shadow under those as they sprout out from around the face and the neck area. So if we put a bit of blue violet there now, then that's going to give us a nice base to build some shadow on, or whatever your dark colour is. Might not be blue violet. If you don't have a blue violet, you need to get one. or something similar. Okay, so see how that's already starting to look like it's got some sort of contour happening. It's kind of nice. All right. So we're going to blend this bit in, and then we'll go and have a break, and then we'll come back and get stuck into all the other bits and pieces. So let's just push this in with your fingers. So when you're blending with your fingers with pastels, or even drawing, doesn't matter really what you're doing, it's important to notice the direction of the thing that you're drawing or painting, or the texture of it. So for instance, when we drew in the feathers before with the charcoal, we did them all in the one direction, right? Because that's where they grow. And so we need to look at this red section and figure out what direction is it going in, or what does it feel like, and try to kind of communicate that with the way that you're going to move your finger in the pastel. So let's start under the beak here where we've got some shadow. And I feel like for this particular texture on the rooster, I feel like I want to do these little round kind of movements, because it's not, if I pull it around like this, that's not really what it feels like, is it? That's going to give me a kind of a smooth outcome. And this is not smooth, it's bumpy and lumpy and a bit rough looking. So I feel like I want to sort of rub it around in a loose little movements with my one finger. And by doing that, it's actually picking up a bit of the texture of the paper too. So that's quite nice. So yeah, I don't want this to look like it's a smooth, shiny thing. It's got to have texture, and it's got to be a bit gritty, I guess. So let's just rub this in and move your finger in the direction that you feel this thing runs in or feels like. I know that sounds really weird, but it's true. And it would be the same if you were using a paintbrush. You would either do big, lovely, long sweeps with a paintbrush. If you were doing this kind of texture with a brush, you might stipple it, which means, having a thick, hard brush and sort of dabbing it to get those little speckly kind of texture feelings in it. So I'm going to do these little round sort of movements. And as you do that, what you're doing is you're pulling that shadow colour out into the red. So it's starting to have form. Can you see how that's working? Now I've only got one layer of colour on here, so we'll have to add some more and build it up nice and thick. So it's still quite thin, and you can still see some of the paper underneath, and that's okay. But what I'm doing is looking at the shadow and figuring out which direction does that shadow go in. So for instance, under this little S-bend thingy, the shadow is harder or darker on the edge of that, isn't it? So where's my pastel gone? So on the edge here, where the light and the dark meet, it's darkest there. And then as you come out this way, the shadow lightens up and kind of fades off into the red. So what we want it to do is be darkest right on that crease there, and then gently kind of merge out into the red so that it's softer as it comes out. And then see where here it's a little bit lighter, so it looks like it's folding out towards you and catching the light just there. So what I could do is pop a bit more red on there, a bit more pastel. I feel like I want more pigment on here, and then blend that in and see how that's starting to now create form. You can actually see this is coming forward, catching the light, it's casting shadow under there, and then the shadow is slowly, gently fading into the red again. So it's looking like it's got texture and form. That's what we want to achieve. Cool, cool. So think about, when you're blending it like this, think about the direction you're blending it in, and then which direction does the shadow go? So where's the fold? What bit's on top and what bit's underneath? And whatever's underneath has to have a darker or deeper shadow. and whatever's on top, on the edge of that, is lighter, yeah? So this section here looks like it kind of has this, I don't know, a sideways sort of texture, and then it lifts up and we've got this lovely bright edge down here. So see how that's starting to get some form? So that's the kind of thing you've got to think about, really, is you know, which direction is everything going in. And when we paint with pastel, it's always better to paint from back to front. So if something's behind something else, it's best to do the thing that's at the back or behind first, and then work forward so that you're doing your last layers, you know, the final top layers last. And that way you can kind of build up on what's already underneath. It's much easier because they get so smudgy and dirty. It's a lot easier to go from back to front, basically. So I'm just smushing all this around, getting some of getting the pigment pushed into the paper, basically, because what we want to do is make sure that gets in there so we can add more over the top. And if you're working on this sandy, sort of gritty paper, you might find your fingers will start to hurt after a while, because it can get pretty hard on your fingers. So I'm just running this around. What I'm doing on the edges here, remember we popped some dark down here where the feathers begin and the red stops. So I just want to push that dark in through there too while I'm here. And see, I'm pulling that in the direction the feathers grow. So now I'm doing bigger movements, even though you can hardly see it. It's going to have an impact later on. So everything you do now will kind of be the foundation for what we're going to do next. And if we muck it up, doesn't matter, we can fix it later. We can go over stuff, it's really good. Pastels are not permanent, and the nice thing is, you know, they don't dry and they don't set, and they just literally stay exactly like this forever until you change it with a fixative or something like that. But you could literally just leave this for 6 months and come back and it'll be the same. So that's the nice thing. It's quite immediate, and it's what I like about it. I don't have to get all the stuff out and the brushes and the water and the whatever. And you know, if you put paint on a palette and you think, oh gosh, now I've got to use all that or it's going to dry up, and that's wasteful. Whereas pastels are not like that. I love that. I love the freedom of that. Because you can literally just walk into your room and pick them up and do it anytime. So just blending, blending, blending. If your finger's getting sore, use a different one. Just change over. You could use 2 at a time if you wanted to, if you're doing a big area. I find I use different fingers for different things. It's quite strange. So for this kind of blending, I'll use my what's this one? Index. And then if I'm doing finer things or smaller things, I'll use my little ring finger or my baby finger. And then if you have a really small space that you can't get your fingers into, then you need to use blenders, and blenders are awesome. So they come in all different shapes and they have like a rubber tip on them. So they feel a little bit like fingers, so they do the same kind of thing, but you can get right into the tiny spots where your fingers won't fit. So they're very handy. Okay, so if you've got all that rubbed in now, and don't stress too much about where the shadows and things are, as long as they're in the general area that we need them to be in, that will be fine and we can build up on it. So we'll have a little break if that's okay, and we'll come back in about 10 minutes and carry on. And that way, if you need to catch up, you'll have a bit of time to do that now. And we'll see you back here in 10. Cool, so what is it, 2:23, so I'll see you at 2:33. Okay, so now we've got our red and our dark down on there, and we really want to just start to kind of build that up a little bit more. But first I think we should do the beak, because technically the beak is underneath the other bits and pieces, and there's a bit of shadow on there, so you can see where the red part comes out across on top of the beak area. So let's focus on that bit first, and then we'll move around and we'll carry on with some of the red, and we'll do the eye, and we're going to do most of the feathers last because they're the lighter colour, and we want to build up the layers of those as we go. So for the beak, I picked out this yellow colour. I know that seems really bright, so if you don't want to use something quite that bright, then feel free to choose something, you know, a little bit duller. I've also got my terracotta or orangey sort of colour, and I've got this one as well. So all of those three I will use in the beak, and maybe a bit of my blue, violet and red as well. So let's pop, we might put this colour down first, I think. So that's sort of my sandy, sandstone sort of colour. So if you just rub a little bit of that onto the beak area. So all we want to do at this point is just get some colour down on the paper. And then we'll push it in with the fingers, and then we'll start working on the different colours that will pop into it. Okay, so if you just gently draw some colour on there. Don't need to put a lot down, we just need a little bit, because what we're going to do is blend that in and push it into the paper. So once you've got that on there, then you just want to get your finger and so this is a smooth kind of texture, isn't it? You can see the flow of the beak. You can tell that it's a hard surface, but it's also reasonably smooth, and that's the kind of feeling that we want to convey, I guess, or get across. Now, if you go in around the edges here and get a bit of the red into the beak, don't worry about that. It'll actually probably help it more than anything. And we can clean up the edges around that later on. So I'm just pushing that in very gently. So now we've got some colour stuck to the page. And if you have a blender, you might want to get into the tip of the beak and just sort of push it in there too. It's a bit hard to get your fingers into those pointy bits sometimes. So I'm cheating and using my blender. This has got a flat little end on it, so it's a good shape for getting all those little edges in there. Okay. So a blender is really helpful for doing those small areas. So that's my base colour. Now I want to add a bit of yellow so that we can, you know, brighten it up a little bit, make it a bit more interesting. So I'm just wiping a bit of yellow over. I'm not going to cover the whole lot with yellow. I just want to put a little bit in there and then blend that in as well. So what we're doing is we're building up some colours. We're blending the colours on the paper. So if you were using paint, you would probably blend the paint in the palette, and you'd make your colour in the palette and then you'd put it on your painting. Whereas with pastels, we do it all right on here. It's all kind of immediate, and sometimes it's a nice surprise when you mix your colours and you think, oh, that turned out nicely, and other times you think, oh dear, what happened? So often it's hard to predict what your colours will do when you mix them together. But most times you'll make sort of a nice, you know, combination of the colours that you've decided to use in there. So now I've got this lovely sort of muted orangey colour. So you can see how by mixing these two colours, I've created this orangey sort of tone, and that was what I was looking for. And you can see also that because I've pulled a bit of the red off the chicken into the beak, accidentally or not, it's picked up a bit of the red, and now it's creating this sort of shadow effect in around where the skin and the beak meet. And that's kind of what I want to do really, because you can see around the edges there, it has got some shadow because the skin is sort of sitting on top of the beak. So there's got to be shadow cast around it. So I'm just putting a little bit of blue violet, so that's my darkest one again, just very lightly in that area there because I want to make the shadows a little bit stronger. And I'm also going to draw a line where we've got the top beak comes down over the bottom beak, and pop a line through there with my blue violet as well. Okay, and then we can smudge that in and soften that all off, so then it's all going to be kind of merged in together and creating a really nice feeling of texture and body. So see how I've just pushed that shadow through from the edge out towards the end of the beak. So now that's created a lovely little shadow from where the skin and the beak meet. And as it goes out to the outside area, it's a little bit brighter. We've got a bit more bright yellow out there, and I can brighten that up a bit more just with a smudge of yellow, just to make it a bit lighter and more interesting. And then I can do the same thing with the bottom section of the beak. So pulling that out as well from the edge, and then just blurring off that line as well between the top and bottom beak. Because what I'm trying to do now is create a little shadow on the bottom part of the beak. Because the top part, kind of where it closes over it, it's casting a shadow down onto the bottom section. And so by just pushing that around and softening that off, I'm creating a bit of a shadow there. And then to emphasize that even more, I can grab my first colour, which is the sandstone sort of burnt umber colour, and just lighten up the top edge of the beak where the two beaks meet. What I'm trying to do now is create a bit of light on the top section, and then that will hopefully cast shadow underneath. I might need to darken that off a bit more. Stick a bit of red in there. So everything reflects everything. And even though the beak is a yellowy orange colour, it's going to be reflecting all the red around it. So it wouldn't hurt to pop a bit of red in there just to give it some consistency and get those colours to sort of connect with each other. So if you pop a bit of red just on the top of the beak here, see where you've got those little brown marks that are sort of sitting on the surface there. So a bit of red and then some of this terracotta kind of browny colour. And if you make the marks coming from the top of the beak and then out across the edge like that, it gives it that lovely gradation of colour and a little bit of a shine where it's catching the light. So the shine is about there, and we can always add something lighter to brighten that up even more. So by popping that yellow back on there, and then as you pop it on, because we've already got some colour underneath, if you just gently blend that in, so the softer you press, the less it'll kind of blend and the colour sits on the surface, so it's much brighter. And you'll find if you keep pushing that and pressing it in, it'll just get kind of darker and duller. So when you want bright, shiny colours and light spots, you really need to just start to press a little bit lighter as you go, so that the colour doesn't sort of sink in and mix in with what's underneath it, and it just sort of sits on the surface. So when you're doing pastels, that's kind of how I work anyways, in layers like that. So you start off with your layers of colour, and when you blend them at first, and you kind of merge everything and push it around and get it all kind of grey and blend it in. And then as you work towards the surface, you let the colour sit on the top, and that way it has this beautiful translucency, and you can actually see all the other colours underneath, but it has this lovely luminescence that just sort of glows on the surface. So now I'm just popping a few little dark marks on the top of the beak here, because what I want to do is get those little, you know, those marks you can see on there. It's like they're brown kind of marks, and I'm just using my blue violet, so that's the darkest pastel, and I'm just literally dabbing them on very lightly, and now I'm going to just dab my finger over them. I don't want them to blend in and become muddy and dirty. I still want them to look like their marks, but I need to push them in just a little bit so that they're not too strong, and it kind of looks like it's all part of the beak, not something just sitting on top of it. So that's looking okay. I'm just going to brighten up this little bit to the side here. A bit more yellow. And gently dabbing. So you've got to kind of practice the technique, I guess. And so dabbing will push colour in to the paper and make it sort of stay there without blending it with all the other colours. And then blending will just kind of push all the colours around and create all these beautiful greys and things. So different sections require different processes. And, you know, at the beginning of a painting, I usually just blend everything and get all the pigment onto the paper so that it's already sitting there, and then start to kind of let the colour sit on the surface and do its thing. So I think that's probably enough work on the beak at this point. I'm pretty happy with how mine's looking, and it's catching the light where it needs to. If we need to later on, I can pick up my white or Australian grey. I'll just try it, because why talk about it if you can't actually do it? Put a little shine on there. That's nice, isn't it? So that is literally just a little bit of colour rubbed over the top and not pushed in or blended or anything. And that's how you get those beautiful brights to pop on the surface. And they just sit there and sing. It's just gorgeous. So I really like how that worked out. And when we do the shine in the eye, it'll be a similar process. We just actually let the colour sit on top and don't push it around too much. Because the minute you push it around, the minute it gets really dirty. So we're going to get back into the red section now. And I want to put some more red pigment down on here now. And then we'll start to kind of blend that in again. So we're going to do a similar process to what we did before. But I just want to fill up the tooth, because what's happened is we've just put one layer down and it's still, you know, fairly thin. You might like how that looks, but I prefer to thicken it all up and make it lovely and bright and really, you know, full of colour. So what I'm doing now is just wiping my red pastel down again over all this beautiful red that we put down before. And I'm actually sharpening up the lines a little bit more. So when I did this the first time, I didn't really do all the edges very well. I just kind of plonked some colour down and blended it in without worrying too much about getting the edges done. But now I want to make sure that those edges are defined. So when you want to define the edge with the pastel, just tip it up and use the end of it so that you get a hard line like this. So I can get a hard line down through there like that. And then pretty much drawing it back in. So drawing in all your sides like that. And then you can just drop your pastel down on the paper and then pull it around and fill in all around it. So it's a bit like colouring in, really. And because we've already got some dark underneath that we've rubbed in before, that's going to show through on this next layer. So this is why we kind of lay the foundations at first with, you know, your darks and so forth, because then when we come back over it again, it's still there underneath and you don't completely lose it all. So that's what we want. We want to create those really subtle sort of shadows and bends and turns and things, and still have them sitting there even though we're putting more down on the paper. So I'm literally just wiping my pastel around over what we already did before. Just loosely, don't worry about being too precise. And then we can blend this in again. So if you've got a worn out finger, you might need to find another one. go. So once you've got lots and lots of colour down on your page like that, and you might find you get a fair bit of dust off the pastel, because they tend to sort of, sometimes, you know, you can push most of the dust in. So I'm going to start to blend that in now. So you can push most of it in with your fingers, but often there'll be little crumbs that just don't want to go in there. And when that happens, you just need to tip it off and get rid of it, or let it drop. If you're up on an easel, it'll just drop down into your gutter or your tray. And so now we're just going to push this in, and you can see as I'm doing that, that underneath where I had those little shadow marks, so along here, for instance, is still showing. It's not as strong, but it's definitely still there. And so that's a lovely, lovely foundation to build on. And you can see now how the red is getting a lot thicker and brighter, because I've got a couple of layers on there. So the more layers you put down, the brighter and more dense the colour becomes. And again, depending on the paper that you're using. So if you're on a dark paper like this and you're pushing it in, you'll find that the dark kind of, the dark paper will have an impact on the colour. So it's kind of going like a dark red, and I don't mind that. It's quite nice. And I do love working on black paper because it just is so powerful. If you're on a light paper, then you might find that your red might be looking a little bit kind of pink, because it's probably picking up some of the lighter tones underneath. And if you don't like the pink of it, then you might need to add a bit more red, or even, you know, you could pop a bit of blue through it to make it slightly darker with a bit of a purple tinge. So there's lots of things you can do to change your colours. And but it's always nice if you can actually buy the colour that you want, I have to admit. It's better than having to make it all the time. Even though making it is great and you do it on the paper immediately, but sometimes you do forget what you used and you don't get quite the same combination of colours, and it can get a bit tricky if you're trying to repeat something. So I'm just pushing in all this lovely red, and you can see how the darks underneath are starting to become more obvious as we go in a little bit harder. So everything you put down will impact whatever you put on top of it. So that's why you've got to kind of think ahead about, you know, where is the darks and the shadows and where's the lights and so forth. And again, moving in, you know, the direction or the texture of the thing that this is. So I'm doing kind of small little movements, but trying to pull those shadow colours around to keep the form and keep the shapes of everything that's going on in there. And I'm finding as I press harder, because I'm on dark paper and I've put dark underneath here, harder you press, or the harder I press on here, it gets darker, and it's kind of fun to watch that happen. So I've left the eye blank at the moment, and we'll get to that shortly. Lovely. So if you've pushed all of this in, and if you haven't, I can wait. So I'll just waffle on a little bit. And what we're going to do next is go back in again with the shadow colour, so the blue violet colour, and just really add a bit more shadow and start to really look at those tones within this red section. And then we'll go on to the eye. The eye's always the fun part. I like doing eyes. Okay. So let's put some shadow in here. So I've got my blue violet again, and I'm just literally lightly putting a bit of that shadow that we had in before And I'm just, I guess, emphasising it a little bit more to make it a little bit stronger. Because what we're trying to do is create some contours and turns and folds and things like that within the texture of this. And we'll put a bit of a light in here as well to brighten up some of the lighter sides. So inside that little S-bend thing, if you look at the shape of the dark part, it kind of runs around like that. And so it's like an upside down bird. I always try to find shapes in things so I can kind of relate to it. And then pulling that around. So in that section in here, just behind the beak where that little S thing is, it's quite dark in there. So we want to make that nice and strong and dark. Don't be afraid of the dark. Sometimes you get a bit scared about putting too much dark down. But yeah, I know what you mean. I've had that before, but it's actually worth risking it, I reckon, because you get a more dramatic result, and it's more interesting. So what I'm doing now is I'm just wandering around with my eyes, looking at all the dark bits and marking those in. So you can see around the beak area, we've got all this red skin that kind of hangs over the top of the beak. And then there's shadow, and then we've got that funny little S shape. So I'm just getting some dark in around there so that it's starting to look like it's coming out over the top of the beak. There's a funny little something in where the top of the beak and the crest meet. Up inside there, it's almost like a bit more of the beak you can see underneath the red bit. So I'm just sorry, got distracted then for a minute. Menopause brain. Just not quite sure what that is, and I don't know if I'll actually want to make it into a feature or anything. I guess because it's part of, or that we should, I suppose, but I'll just pop a bit of something in there to see if that looks like what it should be. I don't know. It's like this is my little terracotta colour, and yeah, just put a bit of that in there with a bit of shadow. And I don't know what that technically is, that bit, but it looks like it's supposed to be there, so we probably should put it in. Hey? This is the trouble when you're an artist. Sometimes you're not quite sure what the term of something is or what it's meant to do or be. But rule of thumb is if you can see it and it's there, then it's meant to be there, I guess. Although we do have artistic license and you can choose to leave things out. But I guess if it's part of anatomy or something like that, it probably needs to be in, hey? Otherwise, you're not going to get it right. On these little crests at the top here, I feel like each one sort of has a dark and a light side just to give it a little bit of body and texture. So I've popped a little bit of my blue violet, just a tiny smoosh of it, and even if you want to, put your finger on it and then rub it onto the painting with your finger and not actually put the pastel on there at all, you can just get some onto your finger like this and rub it on there. If it's a really strong colour, sometimes that's a good thing to do because then it's not going to be too much. So I've just popped a bit of the blue violet onto, I don't know if it was the left or the right side of each one of those now, but I was trying to get a bit of a formation happening so it looks like it's a solid thing. There we go, that'll do. All right. So there's little dints and things. I'm just looking back down around the face area now. Remember that triangular funny little shape we found at the start? between the beak and the eye. So I'm putting that in with a bit of the blue violet as well. It's like a dint or a dip going on in there. So I've just drawn that in very lightly and blended it in. So just run your eye around the picture and do that sort of thing where you see dints and divots. So even around the eye, there's a couple of like circular shapes around the outside of the eye. And if you just do a light dark mark with this and then just blend it in, pull it around with your finger so that it goes all soft and blended, and hopefully it will look like it's kind of got all these little wrinkles and things in there. There we go. And then you can just like crisp up some of the edges. So where, for instance, down here on the side, there's like a really sharp edge. So we've got a bright red and then it goes underneath into the dark shadow, and it's quite a hard edge because it's like a solid surface, and it goes really dark under there. So you could darken that off and sharpen up that edge a little bit, and that'll give it even more tone. And then up under here, so this little section in here, it's going to be fun to put those little white hairs on there after. And if you've got a white pencil, that would be very helpful. If not, we can make it work with pastel. And then in here, so just running around it with your eyes and looking at the dark sections and figuring out what needs to be darker. Does that need to be darker? Darker. Don't be afraid of the dark. I've said that before, I know. But don't be afraid to put more dark down, because it does actually make the brights brighter. And as I said, you can just stick a bit of it on your finger if you don't want to, you know, put colour directly down, because if sometimes it's very strong colour and it's too much. So if you just dab your finger on it and then wipe it off onto your paper, that might be enough sometimes. Sometimes you just need a really subtle little bit of dark. Okay. So now we've got a fair bit of dark on there. Let's get us a bit of light in there too, because we want to brighten up some of these brighter edges. I'm going to use this terracotta colour. Now, I don't know if that's going to be light enough, but what I want to do is start off conservatively and just see if that's going to be light or bright enough, or is it too much the same as the red and it's not giving me enough shine. Let's see. Bit dull, isn't it? Let's try yellow. So yellow with red will kind of go orange. And again, I don't want this to be super bright. I'm just testing this. You don't have to do it yet. So this is, you know, you've got to be a little bit brave sometimes and test things. No, I don't like that. It's far too dull. So I'm just going to go over it with red. So instead of doing that, let's just lighten up some of these lighter red areas with a bit more red, and we'll let it sit on the surface, and that hopefully will be enough to make it shine without having to. I mean, you're probably thinking, why don't you add white? White will brighten it up. Yeah, it will, but it'll also make it opaque and go kind of pink. And I'm not a fan of red and white mixed together unless I want pink, but usually it gets quite opaque and a bit, I don't know, it doesn't excite me at all. If you want to pop white in, by all means do it. Yeah, I just don't like what happens when I mix red and white together. If I'm still trying to keep something really red, the white just makes it too milky. And I think it sort of takes away the brightness a little bit. So that, I think the red is working nicely to get those shiny bits going on. And just on this bit here, so what you need to do is just run your eye around here, around the chook, and look at all the bits that are catching the light. I know it's a bit hard to see, but if you look at the black and white picture, you'll be able to see it a little bit easier, just within the red area. So find the lighter areas within the red section, and that'll tell you where to put a little bit more of the red and sort of let it sit on the surface. So what we don't want to do is blend it in. We just want to draw it on lightly like this. So I'm using a short stick of pastel. If you've got long sticks, you might need to break them because it's really difficult to get these beautiful, big, smooth sort of marks with a long stick of pastel. So as hard as it is, you might have to break them so that you get a shorter stump and you can kind of use the whole thing on your page rather than trying to just use the end of it and blending it in, because that can get a bit frustrating after a while. So all my pastels are broken. I don't really have any long ones because I just find them too hard to use. Unless you're doing a really big painting, and then you might want really wide sticks to get those big wide marks, but I prefer shorter ones like this because I've got a lot more control over it. So I think the red, the brighter red, is working quite nicely in those lighter areas. So for instance, there's like a lighter ring of red around the eye. That's telling me that that part is catching the light. And then there's like a dip that goes into some shadow. And then it comes out bright again, like light again, because that's where the skin sort of rises up again. And when you put it down, you try not to kind of blend it all in each time. So as you go, you want to be blending less and less and just letting that vibrant colour sit on the surface like that. And that's when it starts to pop. So you can see where I've left it sitting on the surface, it's much lighter and more vibrant than where I've blended it in because it's pure colour. And pastels are beautiful because they're pure pigment. There's nothing else in there except a bit of glue or something to hold them together. But other than that, this is the best way to get pure pigment colour. And it's just gorgeous when it sits on the surface like that and glows. Of course, then the only problem is when you want to frame or hang a painting, you've got to frame it because it is dusty and loose and smudgy and stuff. So that's the only problem with pastels. They do need to be framed, and until someone finds a way to seal them. Although, yes, you can. That's a lie. You can seal them. So you can get fixative, spray fixative, that will seal the pastels. But what happens then is when you spray them, the colour kind of goes a bit dull and it takes the brightness out. So if you have beautiful bright whites and things in a painting and you spray it with fixative, it's going to go a bit dull and it loses that beautiful vibrancy. So I prefer to just frame it as is, and when you frame them, what you do is you put a little spacer between the bottom of your painting. So say I was putting a frame around this one, I would put a spacer, so that's like a little thick bit of acid-free board, like some of your mount board or something like that. It only needs to be a couple of mil, and you put that across the bottom of your painting, and then you put your matte board, so that's the cardboard frame part, over the top of that. So you've actually got a gap between your painting and the back of the matte or cardboard. And so then if any dust does drop, it'll go down behind that matte frame and can't be seen. And if you don't put spacers in, if you put a matte board flat on top of your painting and hang it, the chances are the dust will drop and it actually marks the matte board. So say you've got a white matte board, you'll get, all the pastel dust over time, slowly. It just drops down and it stains it and starts to look really dirty. So you've got to put spacers in between the pastel painting and the cardboard matte. And that's, most framers will know that. And the other thing I do when I'm framing something, if I haven't sprayed it, and I don't usually, is to get glassine paper. So I'm just yabbering on while you get more done. Glassine paper feels a little bit like like, what's that cooking paper? It's kind of plastic-ish. I've got a piece here, I'll show you. And so you can buy it in sheets. And what you can do with that is, this is a used piece. It's kind of shiny, like wax paper. A lot of people use kitchen paper. It's got glass in it. It's actually made of glass. And what it's designed to do is either you can use it to store your paintings. So when I'm finished this one, if I wanted to store it and not get it smudged and dirty and stuff, you can actually just cover it with a sheet of this, like that, and then clip it on or whatever and store it, so you can stack things on top of it and it's not going to smudge. The other awesome thing that glassine is really good for is, say I finish this painting and I want to frame it and I want to get rid of all the excess dust that might be sitting on it. You can put glassine over your painting like this and literally just rub it like this. So what that does is it pushes the pastel into the paper like this. So, and you're not going to smudge it or hurt it because the glassine won't. And you just rub it around like that and then lift it off. You'll find you'll get some pastel dust on the glassine paper, but you can wipe that clean, it's fine. And what happens is it pushes all the dust in, and so that way you won't have excess dust dropping, hopefully. That's the plan. So that was a trick I was taught, to use the glassine paper to kind of seal your painting just by pushing all the pigment into the paper. And you can reuse it. So obviously I've used that one before because now it's got marks all over my thing. But anyway, you can reuse it, you can clean it, and it's a great way to store them as well. So if you want to store them flat and not smudge them, just pop glassine in between, or baking paper, that's what people use. Yeah. So there's a little tip for the day. All right, let's get on to, goodness me, time's going fast. We've got about 20 minutes. Whew. Let's get on to the eyeball. So what we need to do is put this orange or terracotta colour into the eye in here. You can fill the whole thing up if you want to, because we're going to go around the edge of it with some black, and then we're going to pop the pupil in as well. So if you put a little bit of the terracotta in like that, and then we're going to smudge it a little bit so that it kind of isn't too bright. So what I'm doing is putting my finger in here, and I'm just running it around and around, pushing it in like that. And so that's kind of pushed it into the paper a little bit, so it's going to hang on to the paper better. And then I want to, what else do I want to do? I want to add a bit of red into there, I think. So I'm just going to dab a bit of red on the top. Just dabbed it on with my pastel, and then just slowly rub that around too. Make sure you go round and round in the shape of an eyeball or a circle, because what we want to do is get that feeling of roundness. Okay, now we need to, hopefully you've got a black pencil or a stick of charcoal. That'll do. We've already used that, so you should have some of that somewhere. First off though, before we do that, there's a little, can you see the light section on the left of the eye there? It's on the outside of the coloured bit. So you've got your orange iris, which has a black outline, which we'll do in a minute. Between that and the red skin, there's a little bit of like a eyeball, white eyeball bit, maybe, I don't know. But it's not white, it's kind of a creamy colour. You can hardly see it, but those little things make all the difference. So let's just pop a bit of something in there. I used this, what's this colour? Umber sort of skin colour, I guess. Popped a bit of that in there, and I'm just going to push that around a little bit, like that. Just gently with your finger. Don't worry if you get it down in here, we can go over that with some black or red and get rid of that. But I need to get a bit of that colour in there because that's what's in the picture. I'm just going to zoom in on this eye. Okay, so what we've got is we've got a round orange eye, and then we've got an outline of black around that. So what I'm doing is using my little stick of charcoal. So if you don't have a pastel pencil, just use this charcoal because that'll do the job fine. So charcoal and pastel are lovely together. They can play nicely. So put that in there like that. So that's my outline of my eye. And I'm just going to dab it softly because what I want to do is just blur off the edges a tiny bit. If you look at the eye, you can see that as the dark ring merges into the orange section, it's a little blurred. It's not a sharp, hard line. So just dab it softly to soften that off a bit. Now on the right-hand side of the eye, under the lid, so I don't know if you can zoom in, but I can see there's shadow on this side. So I'm going to put a little bit of charcoal, just a little bit of dark in here. Okay, because that's the shadow. And I'm going to darken up the outside of that. So that's shadow there. And the shadow's coming in over the orange area. But it's very subtle. So you don't have to make it too strong if you don't want to. Make it a bit darker though. Now you might want to do this with pastel. Let's see if we can make it work with pastel. I just want to darken that off in there a little bit more. I'm using my blue violet. If you don't have that colour or you're not confident using a chunky stick of pastel, just stick with your charcoal or your pencil, whatever you've got. So see how I've got that little bit of a shadow now hanging over the right side of the eyeball, and so that's being cast by the eyelid. So the eyelid comes across here and it kind of cuts over the eye, so we can't see all the black rim on the right side. We can only see it on the left because we've got this eyelid that sort of comes over the eye and then comes up around there. So it's on a little angle. So if you use a bit of red to pop the eyelid in, and then I'm back to my charcoal for some shadow again. And then around the edge of the eyelid, there's also a bit of dark. It's even got little eyelashes. It's a little bit of dark line. So again, use your charcoal or your pencil, whatever you've got, to get that little bit of rim around there. And I'll do it around here as well. So around the bottom of the eye as well, there's a little bit of shadow around there. Need to sharpen my pencils, terrible. And then if your lines are too hard or too strong, just soften them off lightly with your finger. Don't press too hard, just gently, gently, lightly, lightly, soften them off like that. Okay. Now we need to put the pupil in there. So I'm going to try with the charcoal. So the pupil sits more to the right, slightly more. So put that there, like that. Charcoal isn't black enough for me. You might have a charcoal pencil. If you've got a 6B or a 4B or something like that, you might find it'll be a bit blacker than the willow, or a pastel pencil. So this is my pastel pencil. I'm just going to make the pupil nice and dark with that. This is kind of the highlight, isn't it? The feature, the whole thing. It's always the eye. The eye is really, it's the first thing we look at. Okay, so I've got that going on in there. And then get rid of some of that white of the eye. There's too much in there now. So I've just smushed a bit of that off with my pencil. And if you really want to get into detail, you can see that there's a little bit of light just around the edge of the eye. I'm doing it too light just so you can see what I'm talking about. There's a little bit of light around there, and in the tear duct kind of bit in here. There's light there too. So I need to get back into that with some charcoal or my pencil or something. And so I've used my pale skin tone colour to do that. And then I'm just literally just pushing it around with the charcoal so that it softens it off a little bit. Because I don't want that to be super bright, shiny, but it does have a little bit of light just on the edge of the eye there. So it comes in handy if you've got a screen or something you can zoom in on. See all the detail. Although I don't want to see too much detail, I will be here for a year. Hey. Okay, so now we've got that going on. I'm going to add a bit more red to cover up some of that there. And then if you've got a blender or a small finger, you can just run it around. When we put the little shine on there, it'll make all the difference. Okay, so I'm just going to tip off some of my dust. Go. Make that a bit rounder. Okay, so if you want to now, you can pop your shine on the eye because that always gives you joy and it makes you want to keep going. So let's do that. So what I'm going to use is my Australian grey. Remember we talked about the lights earlier, and that was what I popped on the beak. So it's not white. So if I want to go white, I still can. I'm kind of going to leave myself some room to go whiter. But if you want to put your little shine on here, and don't be afraid, all you will need to do is just get the edge of your pastel, press it down. It's on the top of that pupil or eye, yeah, pupil. Press it down and just lift off. Give it a little smoosh and lift up. And that should be enough to give you some shine. And if you feel like it's too bright or you want to quieten it down, just give it a dab to smudge it a tiny bit, knowing that you can always put white on top to make it even brighter. So I like to save my white for last when I can. See, that's already come alive, hasn't it? Let's get some feathers in here now. All right, so I'm going to use my terracotta kind of colour. That's my, it's not light and it's not dark. It's a little bit in between, but I want to get the feathers built up and then we can add kind of lighter and darker tones as we go. So what I'm doing here, and it's similar to what I did with the charcoal at the beginning, this is a square stick, so it's an Art Spectrum Extra Soft. They're beautiful pastels. And I love them because you can use them flat like that and get a nice wide mark. You can use the edge to get a hard, sharp mark, which is what I'm doing now for the feathers. You can use the end and get a fat kind of mark, or you can use the tip and the edge to get a line. So they're really versatile and they're lovely and soft. They're beautiful pastels. So at the moment, I'm just using the edge of it. Now, if you've got round pastels, you can do the same thing with the edge of it. And I'm pulling them across, so just pulling some marks across in the direction that the feathers grow, okay? So it's similar to what we did with the charcoal. Just pull it across like this. And make sure you just pull it out from wherever they come from. So they're coming from underneath. Come from down in there. I didn't leave that bit there. Anyway, come on. So you just want to get one layer of those down onto your paper. And we can do a few over here too. So we've got this gorgeous little brow. What we're doing, again, same sort of thing as last with the reds. We are getting a layer down first, and then we'll start to kind of build up the layers with the different colours. This is the first layer of feathers that we're going to put in. So don't put too much in because we want to leave room to add more. Don't forget the little tuft here too. I lost that, so I'm just going to pop it back in here. Just about there, isn't it? So now we're starting to get some feathers going on. This guy looks like he's nearly alive now. This is good. Okay, so then we pick up the, what else have I got over there? This is a different brown, yeah, a little bit darker. So that's like a, so there's this one and this one. They're not very different in tone. And then I've got that one. So I've got those three browns. There's a terracotta in like a skin tone and maybe a sandstone sort of colour. If you don't have those, just use whatever you have, as long as you've got different tones. So we want something a little bit darker than the first colour. Now, it doesn't matter if that's blue or purple or what, as long as it's a bit darker, because what we're doing is building up some depth, and we're going to do the same kind of movements with that one. And just get some of those little feathery marks in there. So this is, it's like when we do grass classes, this is like putting grass in. You've got to kind of just keep doing the same movements and building it up slowly, slowly. So I'm going to pop a bit of blue violet back in there, just around the edges where it is darker, because I want to make sure, see those little dark sections, we put some of this down at the beginning and it's been good, it's kind of blended in. But I want to get a bit more of it on here now, just to create some shadow. See how that's starting to look nice and thick now? Like it's layered. Get a bit of that up through there. Remember, we're saving the white for last, so don't stress if it's not looking white enough yet. White. Cool, cool. Now, I'm going to pick up my Australian grey. So this is not white, but it's nearly white. And it'll look really white compared to everything else that we've got on here. This is going to be beautiful to get that lovely thick layer of light coloured feathers. See how that's building up nicely? So again, same little movements, short, feathery kind of movements, all going in the direction that the feathers grow. And as they're sort of coming down towards the bottom, the feathers get a little bit longer, I think, don't they? They look like they do. So that's nice and light. And I'm going to put some of that up here too, in the forehead bit. And what we want to do is a few little kind of quick marks up in here that take those feathers up into the top bit. And they kind of come from above the eye. So look at the direction that they come in and where they grow from. And put your marks in there. I'm going to go over my little white tuft area there because that needs to be lighter. So it's coming together well. That's good. Lovely, lovely. And then if you want a lighter, more definite mark, just press a bit harder. You'll find though, as you go, and I'm finding it now, it's starting to fill up a bit too much. So I don't want to keep adding and adding and adding because it'll get to a point where it won't let me put any more on. And the softer your pastel is, the harder it'll get to be to stick on. Okay, so now I've still got room to put white, which is nice. First though, we've got to put some of these little short hairs in, and I'm going to use my Australian grey one because I don't want to use white everywhere. I just want to save that for a couple of special spots. So let's pop the Australian grey around where we can see all these little prickly ones, all these little whiskers that are growing out from around the eye. So it doesn't look very soft, does he, around there? It's kind of a bit bristly. So I can see that these look kind of a bit too bright in some spots, but what we can do is sort of dab them in lightly and just push the colour in a little bit so it dulls it down slightly. And then there's a couple there that are super bright, lovely little white whiskery feathers that we could do in white. Just do 3 or 4 or 7, and that'll be enough to, you know, highlight those little ones. So at the moment that's looking a bit, you know, a bit silly because they're too white or light. What I'm going to do is push them in just gently. So I'm not going to blend. If I blend, then this will just all go to mud. So I'm just going to dab, and you might want to wipe your finger in between dabs just to clean it off a little bit so that you're not dulling it all down too much. But if you press on it and don't pull, just dab and lift. So push and lift. Then see how that softens all the marks off and they kind of blend in a little bit. So what's happening is the pigment's kind of being pushed in to the stuff underneath it, and they're not as luminous now, which is good. That's what we wanted. So they don't stick out too much. They're not too obvious. You can even do that in a couple of the ones above the eye as well, just to mute them down a little bit. So there we go, nearly there. Gone over time. I hope you're all still here and haven't had to rush off. All right, so now I'm going to pick up my white, and this is where you get to add the final shine, and it's where I get my most joy from. I've just noticed there's a couple of dark spots up in the crown or cresty thing there, so you put some spots up there if you want to, just to make him look a little bit more natural. Okay, white. I think that's white. Hard to tell, they get so dirty. So let's lighten up a few of the hairs in this little white bristly bit there. So can you see how the white is actually shining through on top of all the other colours? So even though that Australian grey looked really white, when you put actual white in, it doesn't. So we can just add a couple of little white feathers here and there. So I don't want to, you know, drown it all in too much white, because if you do that, it just becomes inconsequential, really. Where else is there really bright? No really bright white areas. There's a little bit here maybe. So you could just put a few strong white marks in there, but that's probably going to be enough. And then I just need to tidy up this edge here where the feathers are kind of leaked over the top. So what we need to do is make sure that this red section here sits on top of the feathers and doesn't kind of merge into them. And then as it comes up around there, they start to merge a bit. And they all grow from there. So that's our chook. He looks all right, I reckon. Looks all right. Could do with a little bit more work, but we've run out of time, unfortunately. So I hope everyone enjoyed that today. And yeah, I'm sorry if there were problems with seeing it or anything, but as I said, please let me know, because if I don't know, I can't change it, you know. So I'll just happily waffle on here for hours and imagine everybody's having a lovely time, but if you're not, you need to tell me. All right, cool. So thank you for coming. I think we had a fun day, and I'm just going to get a photo before I flick over to the other screen. And then, if you're brave enough, I'd love to see what you've done. And if not, that's cool too. You might feel like you want to finish it off and need a bit more time, and that's cool. But if you're happy with what you've done, please send it to me. I'd love to see what you've done. So if you're watching this video, thank you so much for coming, and as I said, please send me photos of your artwork. Any questions, let me know. Thanks.